The signal returns the galaxy had learned to forget. 300 years was long enough for even the most meticulous archivists to reclassify history as legend, and legend as myth. The human supercarrier Indomitable Will had vanished during the Void Wars, swallowed by a spatial anomaly that collapsed an entire star system. 17,000 souls gone in an instant. The Galactic Council held a memorial. Humanity grieved. Life moved on. Until the signal came back. Commander Vexathari of the Andromedan Patrol Fleet was the first to detect it. Her four eyes widened as the ancient frequency scrolled across her console. A pattern she recognized from academy training, but never expected to encounter in reality. Human military code, old human military code, the kind that predated the treaty languages, the kind from when humanity still fought its wars alone. "This cannot be accurate," she muttered, her chitinous fingers dancing across holographic controls. Her crew gathered behind her, a mixture of species from across the Council territories. They all knew what that frequency meant. "Commander, the origin point is confirmed," her navigation officer reported, his translated voice trembling through the universal communicator. "Sector 779er. The Carthage Dead Zone." The bridge fell silent. The Carthage Dead Zone was exactly that, dead. No ships ventured there. No trade routes crossed its boundaries. The spatial anomalies that had devoured the Indomitable Will still rippled through that region of space like scars that refused to heal. Automated probes sent into the zone never returned. Even light seemed to bend strangely at its edges. "Impossible," Vexathari whispered, but the signal continued steady and insistent. A heartbeat from the void. Within 6 hours, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session. Representatives from 47 species materialized in holographic form around the circular chamber on Unity Station. The human delegation arrived last, and Vexathari watched Ambassador Elena Rousseau's face carefully. The woman's expression was carved from stone, but her hands shook as she gripped the podium. "We've confirmed the encryption patterns," Elena said quietly. "It's the Indomitable Will. She's calling us home." The chamber erupted. Voices overlapped in a dozen languages, translators struggling to keep pace. The Krillian ambassador slammed his feeding appendage against his console. "This is a trick, a trap. Nothing survives the dead zone." "Then explain the signal," Elena shot back, her composure cracking. "Explain how we're receiving Captain Morrison's personal command code. Explain how we're detecting power signatures consistent with a Titan-class carrier still operating at 40% capacity after 3 centuries. Vexathari leaned forward in her seat. She had studied human vessels during her military training. Titan-class supercarriers were legendary. Mobile cities that could manufacture their own fighter craft, sustain entire fleets, and serve as diplomatic embassies when needed. They were marvels of engineering powered by fusion cores that could theoretically run for millennia. But 300 years in the dead zone? The mathematics seemed impossible. The Council voted. It was close, but humanity's allies won the day. A joint expedition would be mounted. 3 ships, 1 human, 1 Andromedan, 1 neutral consortium vessel. They would enter the dead zone, locate the Indomitable Will, and discover what had survived, if anything had survived. The human ship selected for the mission was the Remembrance, a modern cruiser bristling with the latest defensive technology. Ambassador Elena insisted on joining the expedition, overriding every protocol and safety objection. "If my people are alive out there," she told the Council, "they deserve to see a familiar face." Vexathari volunteered to command the Andromedan contribution, a fast attack corvette called Silverwing. She told herself it was professional curiosity. She told herself it was duty. But late at night, reviewing the mission briefs, she admitted the truth. She needed to know how humanity had managed this impossible resurrection. The consortium sent the Equilibrium, captained by the notoriously cautious overseer Keln, whose species had perfected the art of survival through careful observation. "I will document this anomaly," Keln announced. "Whether it proves miraculous or catastrophic, 3 ships, 3 captains, 1 impossible destination." They departed Unity Station 17 days after the signal's discovery, slipping into faster-than-light travel in formation. The journey to the dead zone's edge took 48 hours. Vexathari spent most of that time studying every file humanity had released about the Indomitable Will, her crew complement, her mission history, her final moments. Captain Sarah Morrison had been legendary even before the disappearance. She had negotiated peace between the Krillians and the Terran colonies. She had faced down pirate armadas with nothing but strategic genius and unshakable resolve. When the spatial anomaly opened and began consuming the Carthage system, she had led the evacuation efforts, saving 2 million civilians before the indomitable will vanished into the collapsing space. Heroes should stay dead, Vexthari thought. It made the story simpler. As they approached the dead zone, instruments began failing. Sensors flickered. Navigation systems stuttered. Elena's voice crackled across the comm system. "Stay in formation. The indomitable will survive this. So can we." Vexthari watched her view screen warp and distort as space itself seemed to bend around her ship. Her crew gripped their stations, training overriding instinct. They had drilled for this. They had prepared, but nothing could have prepared them for what they saw when they crossed the threshold. The dead zone was alive. Not with life as they understood it, but with energy. Vast ribbons of light that twisted through the darkness like rivers in the sky. And there, at the center of this impossible storm, hung the indomitable will. She was scarred. Entire sections of her hull had been rebuilt with materials that didn't exist in any database. Strange geometric patterns covered her surface, glowing faintly with bioluminescent light, but her running lights were on. Her docking bays were pressurized. And on every screen, the same message repeated in perfect English. "Welcome home. We've been waiting." The impossible survivors. The 3 ships held position 2,000 kilometers from the Supercarrier, close enough to scan, far enough to retreat if necessary. Vexthari's instruments painted an impossible picture. The indomitable will wasn't just functional, she was thriving. Power readings suggested her fusion cores were operating at efficiency levels that exceeded original specifications. Life support showed stable across 70% of her habitable sections. And most disturbing of all, her weapon systems were online and tracking each visitor ship with mathematical precision. "They're targeting us," Vexthari's weapons officer reported, his voice tight. "No," Elena corrected from the remembrance. "They're identifying us. Watch your transponders." As if responding to her words, targeting locks shifted to friendly recognition signals. A new message appeared, this time in multiple languages. Authentication confirmed. Delegations are cleared for docking. Bay 7 welcomes Human Command. Bay 12 welcomes Andromedan observers. Bay 15 welcomes Consortium documentation teams. "They knew we were coming," Overseer Keln observed, his translated voice carrying appropriate levels of concern. "They knew our exact composition. They've been monitoring council transmissions," Elena said quietly. "They've been listening to everything, learning, adapting." A pause, then more softly. "Waiting." The decision to dock was unanimous but uneasy. Vexthari led a 12-person team aboard the Silver Wings shuttle, each crew member armed and armored despite protocols suggesting this was a peaceful contact. The shuttle's sensors revealed more anomalies as they approached. The supercarrier's hull was regenerating, metallic tissue growing over scarred sections like skin healing a wound. Docking Bay 12's massive doors opened with perfect hydraulic smoothness, revealing a hangar that could have swallowed her Corvette whole. Emergency lights cast everything in amber shadow. The shuttle touched down on a deck marked with 3-century-old safety markings that still glowed faintly. As the boarding ramp descended, Vexthari felt her breathing slow, a trained response to unknown threat environments. The delegation waited at the hangar's far end. 20 figures stood in precise formation, but it took Vexthari's eyes several seconds to understand what she was seeing. They were human. Mostly human, but changed. Their uniforms were standard Terran military issue, preserved perfectly despite impossible age. But their skin carried faint patterns of bioluminescence similar to what covered the ship's hull. Their eyes reflected light like deep-sea creatures adapted to crushing darkness. When they moved, it was with synchronization that suggested shared awareness rather than individual action. The figure at the formation's center stepped forward. Her uniform bore captain's insignia. Her face matched historical records perfectly. Captain Sarah Morrison, looking not a day older than the photographs taken 300 years ago, smiled with what seemed like genuine warmth. "Commander Vexthari," she said, her accent carrying old Earth regional characteristics that modern humans had long since abandoned. "Your reputation precedes you. Your tactical analysis of the Meridian campaign is required reading for our tactical teams. We've learned much from studying your methods. Vexithari's translator hesitated, as if uncertain how to process the casual tone. Captain Morrison, we believed you dead. We were, Morrison replied simply. Then we weren't. It's complicated. We've prepared briefing rooms. Would you prefer technical specifications first or personal narratives? We've learned that different species process impossible information differently. Across the hangar, Ambassador Elena's delegation was receiving similar greetings. Vexithari watched the human ambassador embrace Captain Morrison, both women openly weeping. The emotional display seemed genuine, but something in Vexithari's trained observer instincts noticed details. The crew members standing in formation never blinked. Their breathing synchronized perfectly, and when Morrison spoke, several of them mouthed her words a fraction of a second before she voiced them. What happened to you? Vexithari asked carefully. Morrison's smile never wavered, but something ancient flickered behind her luminescent eyes. We adapted. When the spatial anomaly consumed us, we found ourselves elsewhere. Not dead, not alive. Existing in spaces between dimensions where matter and energy follow different rules. We spent 3 centuries learning those rules, understanding them, and ultimately mastering them enough to anchor ourselves back to baseline reality. 3 centuries? Vexithari's translator made the word sound skeptical even in her own language. For us, it was longer. Time doesn't flow linearly in the spaces between. We experienced thousands of years. Generations were born, lived, and died in the void. We evolved, not through biology alone, but through necessity and understanding. We became what we needed to become to survive. Morrison gestured toward her crew. These are the descendants of my original 17,000. There are now 42,000 souls aboard the Indomitable Will. We've grown. The briefing that followed lasted 6 hours and shattered every scientific principle the Galactic Council thought absolute. Morrison's team, speaking in perfect rotation as if reading from shared consciousness, explained how they had learned to manipulate dimensional membranes, how they had merged biological matter with exotic particles that existed only in void space, how they had rebuilt their ship using materials harvested from collapsed realities. Vexithari's scientific team struggled to keep notes. The consortium documentation specialists simply stopped trying, their recording devices unable to process data that defied conventional physics. But the most disturbing revelation came when Overseer Keln asked the obvious question. Why return now? If you mastered these impossible spaces, why anchor yourself back to our limited reality? The entire crew of the Indomitable Will answered in perfect unison, 42,000 voices speaking through various communication systems simultaneously. Because we're still human. We never forgot home, and humans always come back for their own. The temperature in the briefing room seemed to drop. Elena leaned forward. What does that mean? Come back for their own? Morrison's expression finally showed something other than calm welcome. We know about the Convergence War. We've been monitoring Council transmissions for 40 years, ever since we learned to extend our awareness back into normal space. We know the Vexkari hive is moving through the outer territories, consuming colony worlds. We know the Council's forces are losing ground. We know humanity's worlds are next in their path. She stood, and every crew member stood with her. We came back to help. The void taught us things, terrible, wonderful things about how reality can be unmade and remade. We've seen what exists in the spaces between dimensions. We've fought things there that would drive your species to madness, just by comprehending their existence. We won those fights. We learned from them. Morrison walked to the viewport overlooking her vast, impossible ship. We're not the Indomitable Will that vanished 3 centuries ago. We're something new, something that humanity needed to become to face what's coming. The question is whether the galaxy is ready to accept our help, or if fear will make us enemies instead of allies. Vexithari looked at Ambassador Elena, seeing her own uncertainty reflected. They had come seeking answers about an impossible survival. They had found something that might save or doom them all. The choice, the key. Galactic Council's emergency session convened 12 hours after the delegations returned from the Indomitable Will. Unity Station's council chamber had never felt smaller, despite housing representatives from 47 species. Vexithari watched the debate unfold with growing frustration. her 4 eyes tracking arguments she had predicted before docking had even begun. The Krillian ambassador led the opposition, his feeding appendages gesticulating wildly. They are abominations, corrupted by void exposure. We cannot trust what they've become. They're human beings who survived the impossible, Elena countered, her voice cutting through the translated chaos. And they're offering help against an enemy that's destroyed 17 colony worlds in 8 months. The Vexkari won't stop. They can't stop. Their hive biology demands constant expansion. Every simulation shows them reaching human core worlds within 2 years. Overseer Keln raised one of his species' characteristic question-marking appendages. The capability Captain Morrison demonstrated during the briefing, dimensional manipulation, matter reconstitution, coordinated consciousness across 42,000 individuals, these abilities fundamentally alter the balance of power. How do we ensure they won't use these capabilities against council members once the Vexkari threat is eliminated? It was the question everyone was thinking, but few wanted to voice. Vexthari had spent the past hours reviewing her own recordings, analyzing every detail. The crew of the Indomitable Will moved with inhuman precision. They anticipated questions before they were asked. They demonstrated technologies that could reshape planets or tear holes in space itself. They were powerful beyond measure, and they were still somehow impossibly human. Because we're choosing to ask, said a voice from the chamber entrance. Every head turned. Captain Sarah Morrison stood in the doorway alone. Her bioluminescent patterns dimmed to barely visible traces. She wore a simple uniform with no weapons, no entourage, nothing but the quiet confidence of someone who had stared into the abyss and learned its language. You cannot be here, the council speaker protested. This is a closed session. I know. Morrison walked to the chamber's center, where traditional protocol forbade anyone except council members. I also know that 43 delegates have already drafted proposals to quarantine the Indomitable Will in the dead zone permanently. 17 have suggested more aggressive responses. I understand your fear. I respect it. But I need you to understand something crucial. She touched a holographic control and the chamber's display activated. Images appeared. Horrifying, beautiful, impossible images of entities that existed in the spaces between dimensions. Creatures of pure geometry. Beings made of crystallized thought. Things that defied description because language hadn't evolved to encompass them. This is what lives in the void, Morrison said quietly. We fought them for generations. Lost thousands learning their patterns. Won through adaptation and understanding rather than force. We became what you see because the alternative was extinction. Not just our extinction. These entities, some of them, they hunger for dimensional boundaries. They want to break through into baseline reality. We stopped them. We've been stopping them for 3 centuries, and now we're here because humanity asked a simple question. She turned slowly, making eye contact with as many representatives as physically possible. If we could come home, should we? If we could help our original species survive even though we've changed beyond recognition, was that obligation still binding? We debated this for decades. Not everyone agreed. Some wanted to stay in the void, continue evolving, explore the infinite spaces we'd discovered. But the majority voted to return. Because family matters. Because loyalty matters. Because humans, even transdimensional void-adapted, fundamentally altered humans, don't abandon their own. The chamber remained silent. Vexthari felt her breathing steady. This wasn't a threat or a negotiation. It was something simpler. A choice. The Vexkari are dangerous, Morrison continued. But they're 3-dimensional, bound by conventional biology and standard physics. We know how to fight threats like that. We can help. But only if you choose to trust us. Only if you decide that what we've become doesn't erase what we were. We won't force this. We won't intimidate or manipulate. We're simply asking, do you want our help? Ambassador Elena stood. Yes. Humanity accepts. Unequivocally. The Andromedan fleet support this decision, Vexithari added, surprising herself with her certainty. I have reviewed the tactical data. The Indomitable Will can do things our conventional forces cannot. We need unconventional solutions. The vote took 3 hours. It was closer than Vexthari liked. 53% in favor, with significant opposition blocks demanding safeguards and limitations. But it passed. The Indomitable Will would join the defensive line against the Vexkari advance. The first battle came 6 weeks later at the colony world of New Pretoria. The Vexcari hive fleet arrived with 700 organic warships, each one a living creature the size of a city, coordinated through biological networking that conventional jamming couldn't disrupt. Council forces numbered 300 ships across multiple species, including the Remembrance and Silver Wing. They were losing. Then the indomitable Will arrived, not through conventional FTL but by simply existing in normal space where void space had been a moment before. She hung above New Pretoria like a cathedral made of starlight and impossibility, her reconstructed hull glowing with patterns that hurt to perceive directly. All ships, this is Captain Morrison, hold position and protect the evacuation transports. We'll handle the hive fleet. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a demonstration of power that would haunt Vexithari's dreams for years. The indomitable Will didn't fire conventional weapons. Instead, she extended aspects of herself into higher dimensions, folding space around the Vexcari ships. The organic warships found themselves cut off from their hive coordination, isolated in pocket dimensions where their biological imperatives screamed for connection that couldn't exist. They surrendered. Not because they were destroyed, but because the crew of the indomitable Will spoke to them in chemical languages and biological imperatives, explained that expansion wasn't the only path, offered alternatives to endless consumption. 300 Vexcari ships simply stopped fighting, their crews experiencing something their species had never evolved to process: choice. The remaining 400 fled, their hive mind fracturing from the impossibility of what they'd witnessed. New Pretoria was saved. Not a single council ship was lost, and the galaxy realized that humanity had returned with something far more dangerous than advanced weapons. They had returned with understanding. In the weeks that followed, the indomitable Will didn't press their advantage. Instead, Captain Morrison and her crew began the slow work of teaching, sharing carefully selected portions of what they'd learned without overwhelming species unprepared for dimensional physics. They established research partnerships, they defended vulnerable worlds, and they kept their promise. They asked before acting, respected boundaries, and never forgot they had come home by choice. Ambassador Elena visited the Supercarrier one final time before it departed for its next mission. She found Captain Morrison on the observation deck, watching the stars with the contented expression of someone who had finally completed an impossible journey. "Will you stay?" Elena asked. "Now that you're back?" Morrison smiled. "This is home, but home is bigger than we remembered. We belong to the spaces between now as much as the spaces within. We'll protect both. The void taught us that boundaries are illusions, but loyalty is real. Family is real, and humanity, in all its forms, always comes home." The indomitable Will folded back into void space, leaving behind scanning data and research files that would advance council science by decades. Vexithari, watching from the bridge of Silverwing, made a note in her personal log. Today, humanity proved that evolution doesn't mean abandonment. They came back changed, but they came back. That's the true measure of strength, not the power to dominate, but the choice to return. The galaxy was safer. The impossible had become reality. And somewhere in the spaces between dimensions, 42,000 voices sang in harmony, protecting the home they had never truly left.